Welcome, Carmen Callil, and welcome to you all. It's great to be here in Daunt's bookshop in Marylebone itself during what I've come to think of as the COVID conversations. And to start with, Carmen, congratulations on Oh Happy Day. Oh Happy Day it is indeed to see your wonderful second book, Following Bad Faith, published. And it's great to be here to have a conversation about it. And I want to kick off right from the beginning by asking you, the story of your ancestors, which is what the motivation for this book is it's a love story.
Yes.
And it's a love story of wonderful resilience. It's extraordinary. And you knew nothing about them at all. I remember you saying to me, nothing, just zero zilch. And we find them with you and through you. It's on a detection. It's like detection or a thriller almost. So how did you do that? What was your process of research? And obviously a bit of context for what the book's about.
I think I taught myself how to do that research with my last book, Bad Faith. And it's very good having an obsessive personality. I never let anything go, I knew nothing about them. And also, my hero, an ex-convict called George Conquest, was buried under the wrong name, so that didn't help. He was called Geoffrey. So I thought, who is Geoffrey Conquest? So it started with that, and it took about a year to find out he was truly called George. And I used the same family researchers that I'd used for my last book. Because in my last book, I had to track down a miserable set of Tasmanian people who had... she'd married a war criminal, because that book was about the deportation of the Jews of France. Anyway, once I got his correct name, I could get his birth certificate, and that's how it began. Because I think one of the things people don't understand is that this sort of history of ordinary people is very available for everybody to write. You just have to go into the documents and the research sources and be a ferret.
Yeah, and tell us more about the story that the book
Well, the story
tells.
itself is
Decide to
this.
follow one element of your ancestors.
My great-great-grandmother, who was called Sari No Name, she was illegitimate, and she took various names through her life because she was quite a clever old bat, actually. And she was one of the poorest of the poor in Leicestershire. And in Leicestershire, they knitted stockings for the upper classes and what I call the sort of handsome male leg, as in the novels of Georgette Heyer, the stockings. And they knitted them on a framework machine, which is as big as, the front desk of Daunt's. It's vast. And they lived in hovels mainly, which this machine took up the whole space and had numerous children, obviously, because there was no way of not having them. Many, many children died. But anyway, Sarah's mother married a man called Alan, and he took her to live in Leicester because she was born just outside Leicester. And there she remained for some time, being no better than she needed to be. She had various illegitimate children, probably many that I didn't find because so many babies died. And when she was about 21, she became pregnant with a baby. Now, the Poor Law of 1834, changed the world for the poor in England and made it more like Thatcher's Britain, so that took away all the support that they had. But this baby was born in 1831, and she had the support of the parish. But the parish were rather like George Osborne, even before the 1834 Poor Law. And you had to find the father and name him, point the finger, so that he paid for the baby, so that the parish didn't have to pay for the baby. And they found the father, who was a canal boatman called George Conquest, who'd stolen a piece of hemp from the man who owned the piece of hemp, which was stupid of him, but he was never stupid again, actually. And he was arrested, tried, and transported to Australia for 9 years.
And he stole it. He stole that piece of hemp.
He stole the hemp to pay for the baby.
To meet his obligations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He had to. because they had no money. This particular family, the Conquests, were brickmakers in Market Harbour and canal boatmen. And the story of the English canals, which is in my book, is one of the best stories of English life, really. I mean, my book is not very kind to the English of today, but it's full of praise for the English in many ways. And I think that the great engineers of the 19th century were simply remarkable, as were the men like my ancestors who dug the canals. Anyway, so George Conquest was arrested, and I think the chapter that I find most harrowing, though not everybody else does, is the year on the hulks. He spent a year on the hulks, which festooned the southern coast of England. Words fail me to describe how they were treated. Vermin, disease, beatings. They were beaten from dawn to dusk, and they were chained, always chained, and lugged off to work in the Arsenal, not the football club, but the Royal Arsenal, from which I presume Arsenal takes its name.
So these were the prison hulks.
The prison hulks.
Great Expectations.
Absolutely.
And indeed, Dickens is a theme that runs beautifully through the book. And also you talk about, because I found those, I thought I knew something about the prison hulks, but what I realised from reading your book and that chapter in particular is that I knew nothing by comparison. But of course what we do remember is that is Great Expectations, and you talk about how you think Dickens had a very good knowledge of
yes.
that.
Well, in a way, I think Dickens is the patron of my book. He was my hero as a child and remains so all my life, because he knew about how the poor lived in 19th century England, and he wrote about it. But he never wrote about the Midlands. In fact, very few people seem to me to have written about life in the Midlands in the 19th century. I couldn't find a great deal. And yet their conditions were exactly as Dickens described in his most evocative descriptions of the lives of the poor in the 19th century. Words fail me to describe. Well, they didn't fail me, actually. I gathered up the words to be able to describe the absolute hell in which they lived in these hovels with this great machine in taking up all the room. And of course they couldn't afford candles. So after dark, the children went out in the streets and raised Cain, which is why, of course, they were so much caught up by the law, because the law and the governments of the time were hysterical about the poor. They were terrified of the poor because they thought they would take away their property and their possessions, which I seriously wish they'd done more of. But so they're often recorded in the newspapers of the time. That's how I found a lot about them.
Right. So how do we get from the prison hulks from there onto convict ships and to
Okay, so in 1829, his year on the hulks was finished, and he sailed off on the SS Nithsdale with about 500 other convicts. It wasn't a bad ship, because by the time he went, 1829, the English had discovered that if they sent the convicts out in the way they sent them originally, they couldn't work when they get there, mainly because 90% of them were dead, but also they arrived in such a frightful state on those early convict ships that quite often they'd just pick this near-dead body up and throw them into the sea when they arrived, because they were no use to work at all.
And they needed able bodies to build the colonies.
They needed able-bodied convicts. And by that time, of course, free English settlers had come and taken all the land from the indigenous population, free English settlers. And the free English settlers wanted slave labour, and that is exactly what the early convicts were, slave labour. And then the other interesting thing I discovered, of course, about that, which very much connects with Black Lives Matter, which they do, I wish people had noticed it before, is that in 1803, the cause of abolishing slavery had begun. It didn't finalise until just after 1830, but all the English ship owners realised they were going to lose their business. Some of those men, beg a belief. Trump has nothing on them. I mean, Trump is modest in comparison. Anyway, they thought, how am I going to make money now? And so they seamlessly moved from shipping slaves to shipping the convicts. And so they provisioned them.
Using the same ships?
Same ships, I think, sometimes. Though quite a lot of the ships, I think, were some of the ships, the hulks were the ships that they'd taken in the Napoleonic Wars, French ships and things like that, which were no good or aged, and they'd fit them out to be prison hulks. But so they moved seamlessly into shipping convicts.
So how does George progress?
So George gets there. And
off the convict ship, what he's standing up.
And he's in very early Sydney. And then he's sent by ship to the Hunter Valley, which today is very famous for its wine, but then was one of the richest parts of New South Wales. It was very beautiful too. And
a paradise. You described the flying jewels of the birds.
I still think that Australian animals and trees and its foliage is something I'll miss all the rest of my life. But I have to say, particularly the birds. The birds are wonderful. Anyway, he gets to there. And he has 3 different owners. The first 2 are nothing to boast about, so I think he probably had a very hard time. But he moved on. Convicts could move on. And he had talents, you see, because he was the son of a brickmaker and a canal boatman. And brickmakers were the most valuable, except for people who could write, brickmakers were the most valuable convicts to have. And they were asked for. And so I think he was probably asked for by this very, very lovely Scottish human being called David Reed, who had a big, big property in just below Canberra. And that's where George saw out his sentence. He was extremely lucky because this was a really good convict owner. They were rare. But he would have seen terrible things because all the chain gangs were around him, and he would have seen many convicts arrested for stealing a gum leaf or something and beaten to a pulp and sent off to the penal islands, which were a great deal worse than where George was. Anyway, he serves his sentence, and the son of his owner has learned that there's this very rich area to the south of New South Wales, which was the original convict settlement. And they cross down from Sydney over the mountain ranges, through rivers and streams and everything, where, of course, his water experience would be excellent. And he's one of the earliest people to arrive in Melbourne, which was only founded in 1836. And he got
unfortunately named Melbourne.
Unfortunately.
You're very entertaining about
why don't they change the name?
Lord Melbourne.
Lord Melbourne. Let me see. I think I'd compare Lord Melbourne to George Osborne, really, and his lack of charity to the people amongst whom he lives. He lived then. He was Queen Victoria's favourite, whatever he was. I think he was leader of, Prime Minister. But anyway, so Lord Melbourne, they named Melbourne after this miserable man, and there George remained. But then in 1851, a second wonderful thing happened, which is they found gold. And that period in Victoria is completely wonderful. The whole world turned up to Melbourne at that point. Another reason, of course, which is why when they invented white Australia later, it baffled me entirely, because all the early settlers were a mishmash of absolutely everything, not to mention much intermarriage with the indigenous population. I don't think anybody really knows how many Australians have indigenous Australian blood. So anyway, George found gold. But the best thing he did was he became a Buloki. Now, a Buloki is a man who has about 6 bullocks, great big animals, like that, just the size of that animal that the Queen kills in the first episode of The New Crown, which nearly gave me hysterics. Have you seen The New Crown? Well, anyway, she kills a stag, or they kill a stag. Great, big, wonderful animals. And you'd have 6 of them.
The great metaphor for Princess Diana, that one.
And everybody needed a Buloki because of the distances, you see. They have to go between Sydney and New South Wales. So he made a lot of money as a Buloki, and he found gold. And when he made some money, he got on a boat, came back to Leicester,
Extraordinary.
and found Sarah, and he brought her back to Melbourne to a little wooden cottage.
This is decades later.
I know, 37 years later, I think, he went back for her.
It's like, you get to that bit of the book and you literally, your hairs go back up on the back
I
of your
so
neck,
agree.
It's so amazing, and that you discover that connection, and
Yes.
that it was, it was just that thing that they had, and of course, the child, and then this, and she goes back with him to Australia.
Absolutely, and she has an extremely good life, and she dies when she's about 82 or 83, which is amazing age for someone raised as she was. In fact, all my Australian women ancestors died between 80 and 90. They all sailed out on these terrible ships and lived on the smell of an oil rag or nothing when they lived here.
And Carmen, towards the end of the book, I mean, you explained early in the book about you've decided to follow this trajectory of your ancestors, but of course there's the other side as well, and you say a little bit at the end about the Callil side.
Oh yes. Well, I mean, I think I'm a very typical Australian. When I first came here, people always used to tell me I was Lebanese. I'd say, I'm not Lebanese, I'm Australian. What are you talking about? Anyway, my Lebanese great-grandfather was the first Lebanese to go to Australia, and he arrived in 1881. And my Irish lot left because of the famine. So I'm a descendant of Irish famine. Well, what can you say about Ireland? The first British colony. I mean, their lives were simply terrible in Ireland because they lived during the famine, my great-grandmother did. And of course, she lived just near Skibbereen, which is the centre of the worst part of the Irish famine. It's the centre for the museum for the famine these days. So the Irish ones came from there. The Lebanese ones came from the top of Mount Lebanon. And they were Catholics, Roman Catholics, because they were a funny little sect that live on top of a mountain. Raging Catholics, actually, very, very angry people. And my English ones came from the Midlands. So I wasn't Lebanese, I was bits and pieces like all Australians are.
I want to come back to what you're saying to the land of your birth, as well as the question of what you're saying to England, to the land of your adoption. But before I do that, I just want to. It's an odd thing to be talking about in the morning, but flogging, and I think that very seriously, your study and analysis and what you discovered about, if you like, the sort of discipline and punish of flogging and how it was used by the British Empire is a very important theme that runs through the book.
Yes. I can't understand why this aspect of the of British history is not taught in schools. I can see that it's unpleasant to know it, but I find it very baffling that the English can't accept that they did wonderful things, but they did terrible things in the empire. And I want to say to everybody, though I wrote about Australia because it's where I come from, I had to learn about other countries as well in my study of how they treated their people. And India was by far the worst in the flogging situation, and the Caribbean. Oh.
But you make the point that it's managed or made acceptable by stage managing it, by computing it.
It was always an event, and they came out with fife and drums, so to speak, not quite. But the most extraordinary thing about them is they recorded everything. They recorded every single whip. So it's there for everybody to read. It's online as well now. And so let's take, say, you, Brett, manager of Dawn's. They'd say, first whip, didn't cry. Second whip, blood came. Third whip, started to cry for his mother. Fourth whip, and then at the end they just put, I don't think he'd ever been whipped before. And so all of these flagellation of Australian convicts is recorded perfectly. I would have thought India was the same. I doubt they recorded everything they did to the Caribbean, because I've got a feeling, Caribbean islands and other islands, I think they probably treated them worse. Now, if you don't know things like that, I think it corrodes the body politic. It means that you have no sense of your true history. And I think the troubles that we've found ourselves in recent years, whereby we constantly take away benefits and help and methods of living well with those amongst whom we live. Each government has done that since the time of Thatcher. Now, I can see that people want to make money, and in fact, I'm very fond of money myself when I have it. But I can't see the moral value or the ultimate value of living with people who are hungry, not fed, have no house to live in, but above all, I think, don't have equal education. I've got a feeling that one of the problems is the lack of equal education in this country. And David Kinniston wrote a wonderful book about that last year, that I think one of the salvations of this country will be when the private schools reach out to apply their standards of education to the rest of the country. Because it's education that will change how English people know and appreciate their history, and what they really have to face up to is that their greatest cruelty, I think, has always been to their own people.
And but on that point, I mean, there has to be a relationship between standards and the actual substantive content of the curriculum.
Yes.
And you've talked about the desperate need for curriculum reform. I mean, you just alluded to it there. What do you think needs to be done to the history curriculum? Or is it just history? Is it other subjects as well?
Oh no, I investigated the curriculum because I did exactly the same with Virago. That was my main aim with Virago, to change the curriculum. Because nobody ever read any of these women writers that I published, and it was ridiculous. Except
and you
my
did
mother.
that. You changed the curriculum in schools and in universities.
You know, I don't want to sound vain, but as I'm old and weary, I think...
I'm bigging you up. You really, I know, I went to the University of Virago, so I know you changed.
Just look around you.
Yes, I do think people read those writers now. Well, that's what has to happen. They have to read both. You don't stop reading Dickens and Milton and anything else you like, and you don't, John le Carré and Lee Child, but you read your other traditions as well. And also, that I have to say, that I started this book 10 years ago before anybody thought of Black Lives Matter. But it does connect to Black Lives Matter, because when you live amongst people, you want to know about them, and you must learn about them and their histories. Because not knowing means that you go to, do you remember you go to sort of Portsmouth when you're waving off ships to the Falklands, and you think that's a great thing.
I can't believe you did that, Carmen.
I certainly did not. But I mean, English people want to wave and cheer things that seem very insane to me. They should be waving and cheering when we no longer need food banks and when the education system is reformed. That's the waving and cheering time.
And you talk about that in the book, and you talk about, you use that paradigm of the pyramid, which is really, really helpful.
It is.
And you talk about how that pyramid that you see going right back to, to pre-Georgian times and right through to, from Georgian to George Osborne, as I think I heard you say once. But that you're concerned about the fact that it's the same invested elite that continue to benefit and to hold that power. But I wanted to come back to that thing that I mentioned to you earlier about, is we've talked something about Britain and about here. But what are you saying in this book to the land of your birth?
To them, I'm saying that, well, actually, it's not unlike here. There are millions of Australians who try to provide justice to the Indigenous people, but they always elect governments, just as we do here, that might show willing, but never go far enough. They always say it's very difficult, but nothing's too difficult if you apply your mind to it. And there, I would say, I admire Margaret Thatcher. you can apply your mind, Australians can, to solving that problem. Because with them too, living with injustice corrodes the body politic. It just does. You can't have a good society when there is gross injustice all around you. I think their biggest challenge is to face what they did to the Indigenous people, which I think they face much more than anybody does here about their own history. There's certainly millions of Australians like me who are aware of it. But it's a government thing, really, isn't it? You've just got to take drastic action, inventive action.
I want to ask you about rage.
Rage.
As we draw to a conclusion, because you talk about being enraged 10 years ago, and you talk about a sense of passionate rage. I mean, you call it rage, others might call it righteous indignation, a passion for justice. But in the context of that rage, I want to ask you about what you learned about yourself from doing this book, tracing back through your ancestors, because I found it very interesting meeting these characters and then linking them to you.
Oh.
And you've talked about that sense of resilience and rage. So what was it? Say something about that, what you learned about yourself.
I don't think I did learn anything. I knew I was an enraged person before I wrote the book, really. But now that you've asked me that question, I can see that they were very strong people, all of them. Because what they put up with and what they survived is amazing. And I thought about George Conquest. I thought, even though he was only my step-great-grandfather, I can't ever get steps and greats right, he left money to my great-grandmother, and that money trickled down to my mother, and that helped her, when she was a widow with 4 children, to live. And at the same time, my other great-grandmother was living in a nursing home around the corner and died at the age of 91. And I think they were strong people. And I think the other thing I've learned is I never understood why I was a Republican. And I now understand why I'm a Republican from having written this book.
Absolutely. And it is clearly here. I'm so glad that you said that, because that's a really, really great theme of the book.
Yes, but I would like to add something about that. I've got absolutely nothing against the Queen or the royal family. In fact, I'm sure that they're much more pleasant than as demonstrated in this television series. But I can't understand physically wanting to look up to people. And I think that's what I got from my ancestors.
Well, Carmen, talking about looking up to people, I mean, you also talk about the relative heights of your ancestors. You talk about their eyes, and indeed there are some wonderful photographs. And I have to say that I see some striking family resemblances.
Do you?
Absolutely.
Which one?
Oh, well, I'll show you afterwards. But the family groups, and that is a wonderful continuity. But the other thing that you trace as well, which is really important as we sit here in Daunt, which is full of books by authors who were brought back to presence by Virago, and indeed your own work, which is here, is that you also are meticulous about noting how people learn to write, whether Sari can cross her name on, and you trace that right through. And that history of literacy seems so important, and coming through to you in terms of your own inheritance.
I hadn't thought of that either. But if you're referring to the photograph in the book of my great-grandmother and her 7 sons, one of the things that you notice first in all, which I haven't written enough about, is their great, great pleasure of getting to Australia, apart from the birds and the animals, was food. They talk about food all the time because they never had any here. And that brings us back to food banks. I mean, and see how great fat my great-grandmother was. She ate herself silly as soon as she landed.
Carmen, thank you. And again, congratulations. And I cannot recommend this book warmly enough as a Christmas read and indeed and beyond. And we look forward very much to the next one.
Oh.
Thank you both.